So the federal budget has just been revealed, with ScoMo and his Treasurer Josh Frydenberg proudly proclaiming the first budget surplus in more than a decade, despite the fact that government debt has topped out at more than $356 billion. The Prime Minister is banking the Liberal Party's entire re-election prospects on this budget, with the election now set to occur between the 11th and the 25th of May. Even though there's an infinity of new government spending programs for journalists to pore over every year in their ridiculous 6-hour incarceration in the basement of Parliament House, the centrepiece this year is indeed the surplus. The real question, though, is just how much does Middle Australia really care? In the context of a relatively stable economy suffering from slow wage growth and stagnant productivity, does it make sense for the federal government to hoard your tax dollars rather than spend big on infrastructure, like Daniel Andrews' re-elected Labor government is doing in Victoria? But before we answer that, it's worth noting that the Liberals have just 2 parliamentary sitting days to legislate this stuff before the May election, an extremely unlikely task even with the potential support of the crossbenchers in the Senate. Labor also plans to release its own economic statement, akin to redoing the budget, later on in the year if it's elected, making this whole thing a potentially redundant exercise. In rejecting the usual suggestions from the press that the budget is a vote-buying exercise, ScoMo claimed that Commonwealth spending would be at its lowest growth rate in 50 years. So, in reality, they haven't pared back government involvement in the economy at all. Government spending was 32.9% of our GDP in 2007, but reached 36.2% by 2015, a steep upward trend. The more the government puts itself at the heart of our nation's economic activity, the harder the impact of any reduction in that spending will be. In short, we're literally becoming addicted to government spending, even after 6 years of the so-called adults being in charge. You add to that the fact that this budget contains literal cash handouts a la Kevin Rudd in 2009, and the management credentials of these Conservatives look very superficial indeed. $75 cash handouts for pensioners to pay their electric bills. Are you serious? How about spending that money on highly efficient, zero-emissions nuclear power instead? Increasing supply and reducing those pensioners' bills at the source. See, that would require some real leadership, something this government's been rather short on since MPs deposed centrist Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull over, that's right, energy policy. ScoMo would rather draw on his marketing background to trot out tired Liberal Party platitudes. Quote, "This is a demonstration of what the Australian people expect us to do, to get on with the job compared with Labor's talk. Today is the day we've been working towards since first being elected in 2013, unquote. As if the single most important function of our elected officials is accounting. Now, don't get me wrong, it is incredibly important. Just look at what happened at the state level in the 80s when Victoria was borrowing money every year to pay the recurrent wages of bureaucrats. The end result was a local recession, government-induced economic stagnation, and finally, a fire sale of taxpayer-owned assets to the private sector, including rail, roads, and power plants. And we all know how that's turned out. But an interesting example of why money should never be the sole factor in political decisions is the United States of America. Unlike Australia, the US actually had to fight for its freedoms at inception, resulting in a fierce culture of individual liberty and firm restrictions on the power governments have over their citizens. They're also running annual budget deficits approaching $1 trillion and have a federal government debt of almost $22 trillion. With 7.5% of the population and an exchange rate of about 71 cents on the dollar, the equivalent in Australia would be a national debt of 2.3 trillion Aussie dollars, moving further into the red by 105 billion every year. Yet, Donald Trump still manages to pass billions in personal and business tax cuts, and their economy is recovering steadily. We've been in a comparatively excellent financial position in Australia and for a very long time. So back to the question, do Australians care about government debt, or should we? News polls run for The Australian seem to suggest that more of us do care than don't, although the majority of those that do are already Liberal or National Party voters. But this hasn't stopped Bill Shorten claiming a Labor government could offer, quote, bigger, better, fairer, unquote, tax cuts than the Liberals, along with vastly more government spending, all the while bringing the budget back to surplus and paying off the debt sooner. If that sounds like pie in the sky, it's because it is. It's insane to believe that closing a few tax loopholes and taxing the big end of town more will generate the billions upon billions needed for 50% renewable energy, disability insurance and all the rest. There's also a lot to be said about the disingenuous way Labor paint not taxing someone or something as an expense, but that's a whole other ball of wax. So even if we assume that the old narrative of the Liberals paying down the debt while Labor blow the budget to be true, that in itself is not a policy we can pass a moral or ethical judgment on. There's nothing inherently virtuous about using taxpayer dollars to pay down government debt, even less so hoarding it in a bank account after the debt's been paid off. All that really means is the government's taking your money and stuffing it under the mattress instead of spending it on public goods and services. A common refrain from both moderate and conservative Liberals is that we're saddling the next generation with debt and that this is unfair. But the next generation will be the primary beneficiaries of giant government projects like Snowy Hydro 2, the National Broadband Network, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and even house ideas like Julia Gillard's Building the Education Revolution, which basically cost more than $16 billion to build a new shed in every school in the country, regardless of need or want. It's not going to be a popular opinion, but guess what? Our kids and our grandkids have to pay their fair share on infrastructure and government services, just like those of us alive today. So keep that in mind next time you hear our pollies banging on about debt and deficit. It's not a disaster, it's a decision.